Hello, welcome to the first installment of the new video series for the Actor Project. My name is Jason Noble. I'm one of the actor postdocs, and I'm working currently at McGill University. My talk today is called A Non-Guitarist's Approach to Timbre-Based Composition for the Guitar, addressing issues of notation and mapping. This presentation is based on a paper by me and Steve Cowan, a rising star Canadian guitarist with whom I have a long-standing collaboration that has resulted in a great deal of new guitar music, some of which we will be talking about today. Composing for the guitar can be intimidating for non-guitarists. A lot of canonical guitar music involves complex counterpoint and chord voicings, but the way pitches are laid out on the instrument is not a straight line from low to high, the way that it is on most keyboard instruments. And this makes it difficult for non-guitarists to visualize how pitch structures will translate into physical positions and gestures on the instrument. In spite of that, we believe that it is desirable for non-guitarists to compose for the guitar. Their fresh perspectives can uncover new ways of thinking about music for the instrument precisely because they are not steeped in the instrument's conventional playing techniques. So a different possible way in, besides complicated pitch structures that non-guitarist composers can use to approach this instrument, is through timbre. The guitar's rich palette of timbres may be as appealing as its capacity for polyphony. It's also more intuitive for composers acclimatized to working directly with timbre, as so many of us are in the 21st century. And it may offer ways to compose substantively for the guitar without accidentally writing awkward, excessively difficult music that is unpleasant to perform. We offer this account of our methods in the hopes that it may prove useful to other non-guitarist composers who might be intrigued but intimidated by the guitar. In so doing, we contribute to an already substantial body of resources available for composers writing for the guitar. Many of these resources offer extensive accounts of conventional and extended playing techniques, and they are great assets. But the challenges we feel are not fully addressed in existing sources that we know include the notation of timbral effects and the visualization of the physical execution of timbral effects, especially in sequences. It's one thing to know what sounds you can produce with a guitar, but another thing altogether to picture how it's going to work to put them in sequences in terms of what the performer needs to do to actually make it all happen in time. So our discussion is going to explore problems that we have encountered and solutions that we have found useful with respect to these challenges. We're going to be looking a lot at issues of notation and mappings. Conventional musical notation prioritizes certain mappings, in particular pitch and duration, while other parameters such as loudness are represented a bit less precisely. Timbre has traditionally been represented rather crudely, with textual indications of playing techniques perhaps, such as sul ponticello or tambura, but not very much at all in the way of customized symbolic notation for timbre. To address this, we have developed notation for representing timbre in several ways. I'd like to say at the outset that any attempt to systematically represent something as complex as musical timbre seems destined to be incomplete. But nevertheless, we have found some solutions to be useful. We're going to focus on three categories of mappings in the talk today. First, physical mapping, from notation onto physical objects, such as parts of the guitar. Second, analogical mapping, from notation onto models from other domains, such as vowels. And finally, organizational mapping, from notation onto musical structures, especially when those structures are nonlinear or non-conventional. The most important point that I want to make, though, through this discussion is that notation should not be viewed as a closed system within which the composer is bound to work, but as an open system over which the composer has a certain amount of creative control, a system that can be modified freely to reflect the particular problems and solutions of a given project. First is physical mapping. And I'll begin this section by noting that, as every string player knows, most available pitches can be played on multiple strings, and the choice of where to play it depends partly on technical considerations and partly on the sounding result. So sometimes composers specify a string number above the note, and when they do, they provide a physical mapping in addition to pitch information, often because of subtle timbral differences between the same note played in different positions. Now, for non-pitched or semi-pitched sounds, the differences can arguably be greater. Muted guitar strings can sound dramatically different depending on the position of the left hand, as is visible in these spectrographs. What you see here are spectrographs of the high E string, muted near the nut, near the middle of the string, and between the fretboard and the bridge. While these sounds are not characterized by a very clear sense of pitch, certainly not as distinct as the pitch of a fretted note or a natural harmonic, changing the physical mute position correspondingly changes the distribution of noise energy in the sound, which causes the differences you see in the shapes of the spectrographs, and also differences in the perceived brightness of the timbre. So we're going to hear each of these examples. Here is the high E string muted near the nut, muted near the middle of the string, and muted between the fretboard and the bridge. The differences may be even more striking when multiple muted strings are played. Here you see spectrographs of all 6 guitar strings plucked in the same 3 positions as on the previous slide. So first we have all strings muted near the nut. Now all strings muted near the middle of the string. And all strings muted between the fretboard and the bridge. Composers interested in timbre-based composition may wish to specify the relative brightness of muted string sounds. A simple way to do this is to write the left-hand position in Roman numerals above the notes with X note heads indicating that they're muted. We use this technique in the opening section of Take Me Back, a piece I composed in 2017. Here you see the first page. The mute position for the first roll is boxed in blue there now, and a couple of other aspects of the notation related to timing are worth mentioning briefly. For one thing, strum speed for guitar chords is hugely important because quantitative differences in strum speed result in qualitative differences in perception. If the strings are strummed very rapidly, then the strum is perceived as a single fused event. If the strings are strummed at a more moderate but still rapid pace, then the strum is perceived as a texture. And if the strings are strummed slowly, they are perceived as a rhythm. Therefore, depending on the pace of strumming executed by performers, the perceptual differences may be of kind, not merely of degree, and therefore composers may wish to specify the strum speed. In this example, we do so with arrows of different granularity, which you see in the diagram there. Another aspect of temporal organization explored in this piece is the degree of rhythmic freedom or irregularity. Common practice notation tends to specify rhythms exactly, and more recent practices of aleatoric notation tend to leave rhythmic deployment completely free. But there are degrees of difference between absolute specification and absolute indeterminacy. And we know this already from some conventional concepts in music, such as rubato and tempo ad libitum. In the opening section of Take Me Back, we wanted some figures to feature obvious repetition, but nevertheless a range of irregularity in temporal deployment, so that the listener can't predict the timing of the next event as easily as they could if the repetitions were perfectly regular. We achieved the desired degree of irregularity by notating tempo changes, approximate overall duration for each figure and rest, a slash through the beams indicating irregularity, and the instruction plus or minus 25%, which sets the approximate amount of liberty that the performer should take in deviating from regular repetition. Now, this was the first time we'd ever tried this plus or minus range idea. And so I played it safe and assigned the same value to each one, always varying about 25% up or down. A more adventurous composer maybe, or after having gained a bit more experience with this and becoming a bit more confident, you could vary that figure so that some things are closer to regular and some things are further away. In this particular case, we kept a fixed range of variance for each figure. So now we're going to see a little bit of the premiere performance of this piece, the opening section that begins with the notation we've been looking at. The timbre of percussive effects can also enormously vary depending on what part of the instrument is struck and what it is struck with. In our experience, guitarists are not only often aware of this, but they're often enthusiastic to show off the impressive variety of percussive sounds that their instruments can produce. However, we know of no standardized system of notation for this great range of noise-based timbres, apart from littering the page with textual instructions that can quickly become unwieldy if they're used in large numbers. We address this lacuna by developing a two-staff system for the guitar. One staff is the standard 5-line treble staff for the strings, and the other is a 4-line staff, with each line representing a part of the body of the guitar. From the top to the bottom, the neck, the upper top of the body, lower top of body, and side of body. The muted strings constitute further locations for percussive effects, either singly or in combination. In addition to the physical position on the instrument, the timbre of a percussive effect is also significantly affected by what material or part of the body is used to set the vibration in motion. That is to say, the timbre is determined by the combination of a resonator, or a vibrating body, and an exciter, the vibration initiator. And both of these need to be specified if the timbre is going to be notated precisely. There are other relevant factors too, but we're going to focus on resonators and exciters for now. We've found it effective to indicate exciters with icons. In another piece called We Never Told Nobody, we only use different parts of the hand as exciters. As you see there, we've got fingernails, fingertips, flat fingers, thumb, knuckles, and palm. Each gesture in the opening section of this piece is marked with one of the 6 icons in this table. The many possible combinations of these resonators and exciters opens up a rich palette of percussion sounds and an intuitive way to notate them. Each combination of an exciter and a resonator will result in a different timbre. Sometimes the differences are subtle, but sometimes they can be somewhat dramatic. Here you see spectrographs and corresponding notation for each of the resonators struck with the same exciter at a medium soft dynamic. So first is the thumb on the muted strings, the thumb on the neck, thumb on upper top, thumb on lower top, and thumb on side. And now here are spectrographs and corresponding notation for each of the exciters striking the same resonator at a medium soft dynamic. So here is the fingernail on the upper top, fingertip on the upper top, flat fingers on the upper top, knuckles on the upper top, thumb on the upper top, and palm on the upper top. So this is only a partial selection of the possible combinations, but you can already appreciate just how many different subtle timbral variations you have at your disposal when you specify the exciter and the resonator together. Here you see some examples of this notation in context from the piece We Never Told Nobody. This system enables a wide range of percussive timbres for the guitar to be called for in rapid sequences and with rhythmic precision. The notation does not require excessive text instructions, and it's pretty straightforward to read once you get used to it. Layering the timbral sequence out through this kind of physical mapping also helps the composer to visualize the physical execution, anticipating which sequences of gestures will follow easily due to physical proximity and smooth transition between hand positions, and which sequences may require more time to execute, getting between more remote locations on the guitar or changing the hand position more dramatically. This system could easily be expanded to include other staff lines for other physical positions and other icons for additional exciters, such as mallets or plectrums or whatever the composer imagines. Finer gradations of physical positions can be specified by adding text, instructions, or arrows. And finally, in addition to specifying the exciter, resonator, and dynamic, the composer may sometimes wish to specify physical gestures involved in sound production, which can also have significant effects on the resulting timbre. For example, whether the specified part of the instrument is to be struck, rubbed, scraped, or so forth. We use striking as the default mode of sound production and explain deviations from this using text instructions as required. But in a piece where you had more different types of gestures called upon more frequently, perhaps one solution would be to have different note heads corresponding to different types of gestures. So here is the first page of We Never Told Nobody. I'm going to leave the score open, and the excerpt that we're going to hear begins with the music that you see on the page here.
Just don't.
Next, we're going to look at some analogical mappings, in which the notation is related by analogy to the desired sound. The discussion of physical mapping that we've just been through focused on prescriptive notation, which provides instructions for executing the desired sound. It may also sometimes be desirable to use descriptive notation, which provides a representation of the desired sound, often presented with analogical mappings. I'd like to say, as we get into this, that the prescriptive-descriptive distinction need not be considered absolute or mutually exclusive, and lots of notational systems incorporate elements of both. And besides, the distinction between them is not always completely clear. But nevertheless, it's useful to consider which side you want to focus on in best conveying the information that needs to be conveyed for your particular project. Another important distinction for musical notation is between iconic signs, which communicate through similarity between the sign and its object, and symbolic signs, which are related to their objects by arbitrary convention. The question we believe to be most pertinent in choosing between notational options, such as prescriptive versus descriptive and iconic versus symbolic, is what is most helpful and efficient in a particular context. The answer is definitely going to vary from situation to situation and from composer to composer, but I do think it's important to keep these things in mind when making notational decisions. The score excerpt you see here is from Polymorphia by Krzysztof Penderecki, who sadly died just a few weeks ago. The lines on the staves represent glissandi. It would probably have been impossible for Penderecki to achieve the sounds he wanted with conventional notation, so he developed an iconic descriptive notation in which the lines on the page map onto the sounding result of the glissandi. I have similarly found that the common practice notation does not allow for the specificity of pitch that is required for some compositional goals. In some sections of my piece, Take Me Back, which we heard some of earlier, we used recorded speech as source material. One of our goals in this composition was to create a hybrid sound world incorporating elements of speech and elements of music, allowing the guitar to interact with the recorded samples as seamlessly as possible. We decided to use slide guitar, which allows for continuous unfretted pitch variation as a way to mimic the constant fluctuation of the frequencies of the spoken voice. We transcribed musical lines corresponding with vocal frequencies to blend the electric guitar and the recorded speech smoothly together. In order to achieve this, we needed to find a way to notate microtonal pitch variation very finely. Similarly, the dynamics of speech, which are also continuously fluctuating, cannot be adequately represented with the coarse dynamic levels such as pianissimo or mezzo forte. We needed something more precise. So our solution was to develop a notation system modeled on the stylized partial tracking produced by the free open source software Spear. As you see in this example, Spear breaks sound into partials represented as lines, and the darker the gray, the stronger the partial. Users can select partials in order to hear them in isolation or manipulate them, and those are the ones that you see there in red. We singled out strong partials from the recorded speech and plotted them on an adapted, zoomed-in staff, where each staff line represents a specific semitone. Note heads indicate pluck positions, and glissando lines that follow indicate the pitch trajectory. It's worth noting that the lines themselves are not discrete values the way that they are in common practice notation, but they serve mostly as points of orientation for the performer. And so if the line is a little bit above E5, then the pitch should be a little bit above E5, for example. Pluck points are to be executed with the volume on 0, as is explained in the score. Thereafter, the thickness of the line indicates the dynamic, which must be controlled with a volume pedal. We found that when these parameters are controlled precisely, the electric guitar can effectively meld with the recorded speech. In the example we're about to hear, the recording has been slowed down somewhat and processed in an electronic texture that also includes bird sounds. And the tempo alteration was to make it easier for the performer to blend with the recorded sounds. Here's an example. So we've just seen some iconic mappings from notation onto pitch. An iconic mapping from notation onto timbre would be more difficult to represent visually because timbre is multidimensional, whereas pitch can be plotted in a relatively simple two-dimensional staff or graph. It would not be possible to represent timbre as a whole in such a straightforward way. If a composer wishes to create a notational mapping for timbre, then they must consider other options. For example, timbre can be represented symbolically rather than iconically, using arbitrarily assigned symbols to signify timbres that the performer can recognize and try to emulate, using analogical mappings for the desired timbres. For example, on this slide, you see a chart of vowel symbols from the International Phonetic Alphabet. The chart is organized along two dimensions, open to closed and front to back. We might be able to imagine a way that coordinates along these two dimensions could have been represented iconically, but instead of that, arbitrary symbols are assigned to the different vowels, borrowed or adapted from natural languages. Once the symbols have been learned, they may stand as a descriptive representation of the desired sound. Vowels are obviously important in speech, but they're also useful analogies for timbres in instrumental music. Check out this video recorded at Université de Montréal.
Alors, je commence avec un son que j'appellerais un son normal, juste sur le bord de la rosace. C'est un son qui est épais, auquel j'attribuerais le voyelle A, A, A. Ça commence à devenir plus ovale, mais ça reste un petit peu, si vous voulez, justement, c'est rond avec, in English I'd say it's round, but it has an edge, so it's defined. It's not this, that's very edgy, mince, agressif, et c'est pas ça non plus. So it's got presence. Maintenant, si je commence à aller vers le chevalet, ce A commence à fermer un peu.
Timbre researcher Dr. Caroline Traub has shown that there is an acoustical basis for these analogies. Traub has shown that the formant structures of guitar tones vary in a way similar to the formant structures of spoken vowels, depending on the pluck position and the angle of attack of the guitar tone. Effectively, she provides a more nuanced account of timbral variation along the sul ponticello sul tasto continuum, isolating a series of pluck positions and identifying the vowels with which they correspond analogically, represented in this diagram with IPA symbols. In some sections of We Never Told Nobody, our goal was to emulate speech quality in guitar music. So we applied Traub's research in using pluck positions to modulate timbre rapidly. Since our aesthetic goal in this piece was to emulate speech quality, we added IPA symbols to the score, explaining that each corresponds to a desired pluck position and analogous vowel-like timbre. The words spoken in the recording are transcribed below the guitar line, with the rhythm notated as closely as possible. The notated vowels correspond approximately with the vowels in the speech patterns, with two important limiting factors. First, the variety of vowel sounds used in natural speech is much greater than the variety of vowels available in Traub's system, so we often had to choose the closest available approximation. Second, there are practical limitations to the pluck position changes that a performer can execute at the pace of speech rhythms. In particular, movements between very thin and nasal vowels, which are molto sul ponticello, and very closed vowels, which are molto sul tasto, require the performer's right hand to move a great distance, and the performer must therefore be given enough time to get there. Accordingly, we decided not to change vowels on every single syllable and to consider the physical gestures required for execution when selecting vowels for a timbre sequence. Even with these limitations, the frequent timbre changes in the sounding result map much more convincingly onto speech-like timbre changes than would be possible without frequent pluck position changes.
There was a family, a fisherman, traveling across this side of Fairview Island, and it was a nor'easter. And these were boats that were like, not well equipped.
Me and my friends went for a walk, and it was a clear, frosty night. Snow, it was like crispy and our freeze.
They were out there in Sandy Bight when they went down, and everybody on board was lost.
Another sense of analogical mapping comes into play if the music stands in analogical relation to something other than sound. This is the case in the first section of my piece, River and Cave, from 2017 for two guitars. Rather than trying to make the guitars sound like a river, I wanted to capture something of the visual pattern of river motion in the musical texture. We often think of rivers as continuously changing, with the old saying, you can't step in the same river twice. But the visual experience of observing a river is not one of relentless, repetitionless novelty. We do perceive recurrent patterns in the shape of the water, crests and eddies that persist even as they never remain exactly the same. I sought to express this through music that embodies tension between repetition and change, combining elements of minimalism with elements of aleatorics, using shifting phase relations as an analogy for the river's motion. Patterns of between 7 and 11 pitches were pseudo-randomly generated for each guitar, and all possible pairings between them, 7 to 10, 9 to 11, and so forth, are presented. For each unequal pair, for example, 7 to 8, all possible rotational combinations between the two patterns appear once and only once before moving on to the next pairing. As a result, although there is a significant amount of surface repetition in each part, the polyrhythmic phasing changes constantly, and no pattern between the guitars is ever repeated exactly. When equal pairings appear, for example, 11 to 11, one or both guitarists are instructed to vary their pacing ad lib, such that polyrhythm is replaced with polytempo as the source of continuous phase variation. And now when the numbers recur, for example, the second time the number 7 appears, it's a completely different sequence of notes. All that they have in common is that it is a repeating group of 7 notes. So here's an example using a score following video prepared by Joe Donahue. That section from River and Cave provides a good pivot to the next section on organizational mapping, because it was through the organization of musical texture that the cross-modal analogy was expressed. I believe that there is a gray area between timbre and texture. Depending on context, it can be difficult to tell what parts of the musical experience belong to timbre and which to texture. Since the organization of sound events is an essential feature of musical texture, and since the distinction between texture and timbre can be fuzzy at best, we'll conclude this presentation with a look at the role of musical organization in creating timbre textures. The order in which musical events unfold in time is another artistic parameter over which the composer may decide how much specific control they wish to exert. The conventional approach, of course, is to specify the order of all events exactly, and the opposite of this would be to leave the order and perhaps the events themselves completely to chance. But intermediate degrees are possible here too, and in some cases highly desirable. Wind chimes and aeolian bells are examples of contained systems in which sound events and their global harmonic structures are specified, but their precise order and timing are left free. There's a certain charm in the freedom and spontaneity that such systems exhibit. In some ways, they are closely controlled and predictable, but in other ways, there's subtle variation and the potential for new discovery on every encounter. Many composers have called for such effects by writing a set of elements on a normal staff and providing the instruction, play in any order. I have generally avoided this practice because it seems to me that the score is working against itself in such cases, providing an order and then telling the performer not to follow it. And indeed, the strong learned tendencies for readers of conventional music notation is to read from left to right. So even if the instruction to play in any order theoretically negates this, in practice we feel it is much more likely that some orders will emerge more often than others. To counteract this tendency, and to create scores that visually map more clearly onto the conceptual organization of the music, I have adopted a flowchart-like geometrical notation that presents more explicitly the many pathways between a given set of elements without prioritizing any particular orderings. My first piece that exploited this kind of notation was Shadow Prism, composed in 2015 and published in 2019. The opening system begins with a network of 2 nodes, then expands to 3, then 4, then 5, with pacing left to the free choice of the performer. The only rule in terms of event order is that any 2 consecutive harmonics must be played on different strings in order to maximize resonance. That's why some of the arrows are missing in these networks. Because 3 of the strings are retuned using scordatura, the bottom staff, the larger one, indicates the playing position, and the top staff indicates sounding pitch. We're going to listen to this piece in its entirety. The ideas in Shadow Prism were expanded for Fantasy Harmonique, a piece from 2019 for 2 guitar orchestras, one of electric guitars and one of classical guitars. Each orchestra is divided into 6 groups, and each of these groups has a different tuning system. Harmonic fields of great complexity are controlled at a global level, while musical texture is created with a combination of geometrical networks of unspecified order and repeat cells that have a specified order but a free tempo. For the geometrical networks in this piece, I modified the notation so that the available harmonics on a given string appear in the same node, allowing the performers to move more freely through the networks without needing to look for missing arrows indicating unavailable pathways. This piece has been premiered and a professional recording is forthcoming, but unfortunately I don't have one to show you today. So to sum up and conclude, today I showed you some of the things that I have explored as a non-guitarist composer writing for the guitar with the guidance of an expert guitarist collaborator. All of the examples presented have revolved in one way or another around timbre and on using musical notation to communicate various kinds of mappings that are important in specifying timbre. In particular, we looked at physical mappings with prescriptive notation specifying parts of the instrument used to produce sound, or resonators, as well as parts of the hand used to activate sound vibrations or exciters. We also looked at analogical mappings with examples of notation representing sound through iconic similarity, describing sound through arbitrary conventions, and mapping onto extra musical domains through cross-modal analogies. Finally, we looked at the role of musical organization and the degree to which it is specified by the composer in creating musical timbre textures. So thank you very much for watching this video. And if you have any questions, please feel free to visit my website, jasonnoble.ca, or email me at jason.noble@mail.mcgill.ca. Thank you to the Actor Project for supporting this particular video and our new video series in general. Thank you very much.